Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Jones, National Civil Rights Museum. And today I'm here with Dr. Clayborne Carson, a distinguished professor and historian. This year we're embarking on a 60th anniversary of the year 1963. Undoubtedly, the biggest event that year was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which we found out that you were in attendance that day, where you heard the likes of Mahalia Jackson, a young John Lewis, and SNCC, and of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. What was it like being in the audience on that Wednesday afternoon?
Well, it was like nothing else I had experienced in my lifetime. I grew up in a small town of 13,000 people, I think it was, and so that crowd was so much larger than, it was more black people particularly that I had seen in my entire life.
Wow.
So this was something new. I could tell being there that this was either the start of or the middle of something very big, and I didn't know at that time that what was it 10 years later I'd be teaching history, and 20 years later I would be meeting Mrs. King, Coretta Scott King.
Sure.
And but it changed the course of my life.
And we're going to touch on Mrs. King as well, but during that time as well, as a young college student, you also met Stokely Carmichael. Mm-hmm. And how did this connection and influence with him about the civil rights movement influence your decision to write your dissertation on him at UCLA?
Well, for meeting Stokely, it was at a student conference. There was a National Student Association meeting, and I went to it. I was a student in New Mexico, and he was a student from Howard University. But in his spare time, he was out there changing the world. And I know he came to the convention, and his task was to try to get the National Student Association to support the movement, support the march, and he failed in that. But so he was trying to get me involved in that effort. But then I said, well, I'm thinking, since I'm in Indiana now, of going over to the march. And he said, why do you want to go to that picnic? Why don't you come and join us in SNCC? And at that point, it was hard to tell him that would have been the most radical thing. And I told my parents I was going to a conference, not to join an organization. And but there was something about him that because it was just a few months later I met Bob Moses, who was organizing people for the Mississippi Summer Project. And so I didn't know at that time that it was like your life is going in one direction, and suddenly you start thinking of another direction for it.
Sure. And
that was definitely the case. I stayed in touch with Stokely Carmichael until he passed away. Right. So.
And you have a great affiliation with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You wrote a definitive book on that matter. Knowing the principles and the mission of SNCC during that time, and fast forwarding today with some of the civil and human rights activist groups in the ongoing movement for social justice today, what's some of the advice that you would give to the current day organizations today from your experience in SNCC?
I think the way I looked at SNCC is that there was a lot of emphasis on Martin Luther King. He had written his own work. People had begun to write about him. And I said, well, but what about SNCC? That there was this other group there, and it was younger people, people who were taking a different direction. And I just made a decision as I was starting to become a historian of Black America that they needed their story to be told. So one thing that I knew I was good at is going out and interviewing them. I took my little tape recorder and I'd interview one person. For example, I'd interview John Lewis, and I'd say to him, who else should I interview? And then he'd say, well, you should definitely talk to so-and-so. And that just led me from place to place. I just went around the country, my wife and I had a little camper and had our son with us. And so we just drove probably 20,000 miles, crisscrossing the country. And that became the basis for the book on SNCC. And what it was for people who kind of thought of the movement from the top down, I was saying, but you have to think about it from the bottom up. That the young people who came in, they were doing things. Martin Luther King, they asked him to join the Freedom Rides. Mm-hmm. He said, it's too dangerous, you can't go into Alabama. And they said, well, we wish you were with us, but that's exactly what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And in 1961, well, at first it was just a handful of students, but eventually it became 500 students. Mm-hmm. Went in on the Freedom Rides and ended up in Mississippi jails. And that was the beginning of another movement. That was there was always the King side of the movement, and then there was always the SNCC side.
Right.
And I just wanted to tell the SNCC side of it.
Interesting. We talked about Mrs. Coretta Scott King 10 years after you were teaching history, and you get a call from Dr. King's widow. What was that phone call like?
First of all, it was a big surprise. I had met her, but I didn't even know that she had remembered me. And if you think about it, it was kind of an odd choice because I had made my reputation writing about the non-SNCC, the non-Martin Luther King side of the movement, and from the bottom up. And here is Coretta Scott King calling me and asking, would you consider directing this new project to tell the story of Martin Luther King? And it took a while. I mean, we had to work out a lot of details because I knew that this was going to be life-changing. And but when I thought about it, and in fact I remember my wife telling me, she said, do you want to spend the rest of your life, Coretta Scott King calls you and you say no, you'll be regretting it for the rest of your life. And I think that kind of turned my head around, made me think about this, and just said, there's something really good about this, because now I will have looked at the bottom-up view of the movement, and now I can see the movement from Martin Luther King's perspective. Wow. And it kind of brought me back to that day in 1963 when I was at the march, because I could look up, see him on the stage. And I wanted to be in the position of what was it like from his eyes? What did the march mean to him? And so that's been the rest of my life. And I think if anything I bring in my work that's original, it is trying to see it from both sides. You have the charismatic leader and you have the grassroots leadership. How do those two things, two parts of the movement, work together, sometimes at odds with one another? There was a lot of tensions there, but I could see in the end that both sides were necessary.
Right. And you said, you brought up a word that really falls into this next question. As a college professor, what obstacles did you and your colleagues face in developing African American history courses at Stanford? And are there parallels to this opposition and the controversy around critical race theory today?
Certainly. You're trying to look at people who lack a vision for looking around at the world and saying, I understand that world, but it could be better. And some people feel threatened by that, particularly people in positions of authority. Are you criticizing the work that we're doing? Yes, it needs to be criticized. but that's part of the process. You know, what is this country? Look at the United States. It started with a criticism, the Declaration of Independence. Yes, Britain, you're an okay society, but you've made some bad mistakes and we're going to separate from you. So you always have this tension between the old and the new. You have the people who are looking at the society and saying it could be better. You know, and that vision, that's what Martin Luther King, that's what the young people in SNCC brought to it, is that vision of looking at the world and saying, we can make it better. We can make a better world. And that takes a lot of self-confidence, patience, because it's going to be, and then when you've got it done, you'll have another generation looking at it and saying, you know, well, you know, yeah, you brought about a better world, but we can still see a lot of things that are wrong with it. And that's the process of change, is that it takes the visionaries.
Right.
And I think that's one thing that brings the young people in SNCC and Martin Luther King, they were all visionaries. They were all people who could look at reality and saying, you know, not only it could be better, but I'm going to make it better. And I'm willing to take risks to do that.
Wow.
And that's what you need in every generation.
Every generation. Growing up, many people were given a more reflection of the civil rights movement when Henry Hampton produced Eyes on the Prize in 1986-87.
I worked with him.
Right. So talk a little bit about how do you think it continues to resonate with this new generation of history students in a time where there's pushback about how we teach the civil rights movement?
Well, first of all, I hope that there always is pushback, because, you know, education is a process. And the thing I loved about Henry Hampton, Eyes on the Prize, I was probably about a decade into my teaching before I met him. And one thing that we immediately agreed on is there's two ways you can tell about the movement and you can show about the movement. And I always wanted to bring together both of those perspectives. And even to this day, a lot of the teaching I do it's the mantra. You know, I work with Dr. Mira Foster, who's a brilliant historian on her own. And one of the things we always, it comes up in our conversation, show rather than tell. If there's a way of showing it, you can get across the story better. And it's one of the problems that historians have, is we're used to books and things, and books are wonderful. I wish I could sell more of them, but I wish I could also make more films.
Sure.
And I've worked on about 24 of them right to this point, and each of them, you know, you find that there are documents, traditional documents written, but a audiovisual material, a recording is a document. You know, all of these photograph is a document.
Right.
So if you can bring together all of these materials, and I know at the museum, you know, that's part of the goal too, is to not make it so passive.
Sure.
To bring people into it, and I think that that's one of the challenges of the future, is not only to change history, but to change the way it's taught, and to immerse people in it, so that they understand the past by looking at it.
Sure.
And the closer we can bring them to that, the better they'll be at that other task of envisioning something in the future.
Wow.
And that's really where we're headed, is, and I think that's part of the reason for the resistance of people to education. that really tries to say, well, let's look at a potential future. Well, that's challenging.
Sure.
You know? And let's look at what's wrong with the society we have right now. And that is also, because some people take that personally.
Mm-hmm.
Am I responsible for that? And so there's always that challenge. You know, the civil rights movement wasn't an effort among people who got along with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It was an effort of people who were determined to preserve the past as it was, and people who were just as determined, even more determined, to make sure it changed. And you're going to run into conflict, and that's going to happen today. It's going to happen within every group, and in fact, that's the energy that brings change about. Is that ability to tell people who you care about, I do care about you, but I want you to change. And children do that with their parents, and you know
Right.
what that leads to.
Right.
So it's always going to be that, that change is not easy. Creating the United States wasn't easy. A lot of people had to die.
Yeah.
Going through the Civil War, same thing. You have conflict, and but if enough people are motivated by that desire to make things better. Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? It's so wise in the sense that you have to be looking forward, but you also have to be modest enough to understand that the difference between chaos and community is huge.
Right.
And you'd kind of like the community rather than the chaos, but it's going to be difficult. And I think it reminds us also that the worst thing I hate to hear from a student is saying, back in civil rights days. Don't you understand that? When did the civil rights movement end?
And I want to expand on that question. When did the civil rights movement end, as well as the civil rights movement? You just talked about there's two ways to teach it. You read about it, but then you show it. When we look at today and the social justice movements of the current, and people are seeing it, it's all over social media, it's all on television, there's say their names, there's marches alongside, there's several demonstrations. How do we connect the past to today with the same values of the movement back then, the modern movement of the mid-20th century, to this next generation of social justice and activism?
We're doing it already. Look, the Black Lives Matter movement, as much as I love the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Black Lives movement mobilized 10 times as many people as the March on Washington, because they were using modern media to get a story across. The question really became not so much that the movement didn't grow large, but how do you transform those millions of people who went into the streets? How do you transform that into change, into a different kind of society? And that's not easy.
Right.
It's something that there's a lot of movements that don't succeed. And one of the things we have to do is be modest enough to know that each movement pushes the ball forward. It doesn't end the struggle. You're not going to get to that magic point where everybody's going to look around and say, we're already in this wonderful new world. it'll always be a question of how rapidly, is it rapidly enough movement, or will there still be, when you look at Black Lives Matter, well, is it still here today? When did that end? I think you'd find some people saying it didn't end. We're still in the middle of it. So that notion is really a personal one. I identify with the people who have the vision for something better, and I'm always comfortable with the notion that it might take some time. As I get older, I get more impatient. I want the change to happen, but I know that the next generation is going to bring about the change, but it's not automatic. You can have a setback that really sets you back, and you have to accept that modesty, and that's one of the reasons why I think people should study history. Is it does give you that modesty. Right. That when going back to Thomas Jefferson, he thought he was going to create kind of the perfect society. And didn't he know that in less than 100 years there'd be a civil war that killed more people than practically any other civil war in history? So did he fail? You just have to understand that people are fallible human beings, and change is difficult, but it's constant.
Well, one last question. What would you say to the individual that is what Dr. King talks about in his letter from a Birmingham jail, the moderate, the person that's on the fence? They know morally this is wrong, but they haven't expanded on the courage to come out and say it. What would you say to the person today that's on the fence about how children learn about civil and human rights in historical context, as well as the injustices that are still occurring today?
All I can say is that, think about it. Which side do you really want to be on? I really do feel that most people do understand that the world is going to change. So the real question is it going to change for the better, or is it going to change for the worse? The worst position is it's going to stay the same. That's not going to happen. So everybody has to understand that each change is going to bring disruptions. A lot of things that you took for granted are not going to be there. So I think that the best thing that we can do through education is to just kind of train people to trust that sense that they can make the world better. And in the end, you're going to make some mistakes, but I'd rather have them on that side, because change is going to come. And if you are cautious about it, there might be a good reason to be cautious about it, but still accept the fact that it's going to change. So you have to accept that those changes are going to come. And I think that, for example, white Americans who are kind of used to the old ways, too bad. Those old ways are going to go. So you might as well be on the side of, if they're going to go, let's have a conversation about making it less disruptive, less chaotic, and there might be a common ground there. And I think that's where we are as a nation, is that we're not talking to each other very well. We're arguing with each other. But I think that anyone who studies history knows that, hey, at least those arguments are better than civil wars. So have the argument respectfully and understand that the change is going to come, and the question is how.
The question is how. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in today. This is Dr. Clayborne Carson, National Civil Rights Museum Freedom Award honoree for 2023. Dr. Carson, thank you for all of your contributions to this story, and congratulations again on your award.
Thank you so much.
I have the distinguished honor to be here this afternoon with the 2023 Freedom Award honoree, Mrs. Kerry Kennedy.
Great to be with you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy. So we're just going to ask some questions and talk a little bit about the advocacy for the organization that you've named after your father, and just talk about some of the issues that are ongoing today and the mission to continue the fight for human rights across the country. I just want to begin by saying that the National Civil Rights Museum is the site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And inside of this museum, we tell the story of courageous individuals where your father, Attorney General and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, is featured prominently in many different locations in the museum. And so I just want to start by talking about talk up a little bit about the history of your family's legacy in public service and politics, and how that has served as an advocacy for protection of human rights for you.
Thank you. Well, you know, my father, somebody said you could wrap up his life in the phrase, get your foot off his neck. And that's really what he did in his entire life. I think as a college student, he was on the football team, and there was a black fellow teammate who was not allowed to play at Southern universities, and my father said, if he can't play, I'm not going to play. And then the rest of the students said, we're with you. When he was in law school, he invited Ralph Bunche, who was the first Black American to win the Nobel Prize, to come and speak at the University of Virginia. And at that time, the law school was segregated. And Bunche said, I'm not going to speak unless it's desegregated. And my father went and got it desegregated. So he could speak, but it remained so after that. So he had, and then Dr. Bunche stayed at his house that night. And the whole night they had, the people were hurling racial epithets and throwing stink bombs at their house and Molotov cocktails. So he very early on had some sense of the importance of civil rights. Before he became Attorney General, Dr. King was jailed, and he appealed successfully for his release. So he was very committed to this. When he became Attorney General in 1961, civil rights became his most important passion. And, you know, before that, the federal government was aligned with local governments in suppressing Black liberation. Daddy took the power of the federal government and aligned it with the civil rights leaders to create change. So, as you've documented in the museum, am I speaking too long?
No.
Okay. As you've documented in the museum, almost immediately the freedom riders, John Lewis and so many others, were arrested. One of Daddy's best friends who worked at the Justice Department, John Siegenthaler, almost lost his life when he was trying to protect somebody. who was a freedom rider, and the white racist, white supremacist black mob, not black, white supremacist mob hit him over the head. That very night, the John and Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy and a large black crowd ended up in the church, as you know very well. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And white supremacist mob, now 3,000 to 5,000 people surrounded the church, started throwing rocks through the windows and really threatening to kill everybody. And they called my father. My father sent in the National Guard along with his brother, President Kennedy. So, they were very committed. Then also when he became Attorney General, there was a county in Virginia which refused to comply with the Supreme Court's decision on integrated schools. And my father went, and so they shut down all the public schools, and then they built schools that were for white kids only. So literally nobody black in the county was able to go to school for several years. My father went in and federalized the public schools, got the best teachers and professors from Harvard and Stanford and other places to go and teach there. And the black schools became the best schools. And then the white population wanted to send their kids back. So, if you think about working with John Lewis in Maryland for desegregation, the desegregation of the University of Mississippi, the desegregation of the University of Alabama, all of this was his commitment and President Kennedy's commitment. And then the March on Washington, initially they were against it, but not for the reason most people think. They were against it because in response to the civil rights movement, Uncle Jack, President Kennedy, initiated legislation to address that.
Absolutely.
And he thought that a March on Washington would undo the work that he had, especially with the white supremacist senators, in trying to pass that legislation. When Dr. King and John Lewis and others came to him and said, we're going to do this anyway, my father marshaled, this is not well known, but my father marshaled all the forces of the Justice Department to support the march. So they organized where the buses were going to go and where they were going to stay. They organized Sandy Johns all along the route. They organized the police in Washington, D.C. to protect rather than attack the demonstrators. So it was, so all of that really was part and parcel of my youngest years. And, that's sort of the legacy. And then, of course, when Daddy was running for president, John Lewis was organizing the black community, and Cesar Chavez was organizing the Latino community along with Dolores Huerta. And John told me that in the last days of the campaign in California, they had sort of organized the Latinos and they had organized the blacks. And so he and Cesar Chavez went door to door in the white communities asking people to vote for my father. I mean, can you imagine opening the door and finding John Lewis and Cesar Chavez there? But anyway, that was the legacy, and that really informed my commitment to this work.
Wow. And I love the evolution of your father from Attorney General, and he becomes Senator of New York. And there's a story of him traveling through the Mississippi Delta with Peter and Marion Edelman, and he's exposed to the extreme amounts of poverty. What did that do for him as a man and a seeker of human rights?
Well, that's a very interesting story, because he was on the Senate Hunger Committee, which is also what brought him to meet Cesar Chavez. And he went to the Mississippi Delta, as you're saying, and his tour guide was Marion Wright. Mm-hmm. And his Senate aide was Peter Edelman. And then Daddy and Peter went back to Washington, and Daddy asked Peter to go back and do some more work there. And then Peter and Marion were on a long car ride together, and by the end of it, they were in love. So that's how they got married. But, after that, when Daddy came home from that trip, he came into the house, and I have 10 brothers and sisters, and most of us were at the dining room table, and we had a very, beautiful, nice dining room, and all sorts of silverware and all that kind of stuff, and a chandelier. And he walked into the room, and for the first time in my life, and the last time, there was silence. And he said, I've just been to a part of the country where 3 families live in a room this size, and you've got to do something to help those children.
Wow.
So that was, he never lectured us, either of my parents, on the need for us to go out and do justice work. That was the only time.
Sure.
After that, he went to the Secretary of Agriculture and said, I've just seen this hunger. And the Secretary of Agriculture said, you're wrong, there is no hunger in the United States.
Wow.
And Daddy got him to increase food stamps. Mm-hmm. And then Marion came back to Washington and expressed, now that happened in 1967. In 68, Marion came back to Washington and expressed her extraordinary frustration with the slow pace of change in the United States Senate and the Congress. And Daddy said to her, I've been to the Delta, and I've been with the farm workers and to Watts and Bedford-Stuyvesant, but most of the senators haven't, and members of Congress haven't. So you have to bring people here. You have to bring all the poor people here. And she said, that's a great idea. Incidentally, Marion told me this story. And she flew to Atlanta, spoke to Dr. King, and Dr. King said, that's the next thing we're going to do, is the Poor People's Campaign. When my father died, and we had the funeral for him in June of 1968, we brought his casket from St. Patrick's Cathedral to Washington, D.C., because he was buried at Arlington Cemetery. And John Lewis was one of the pallbearers. And we met the Poor People's Campaign.
Oh, wow.
Because we went right through the place that they were camping out that night. And a crowd came to where the funeral train was, and they sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was my father's favorite song.
Wow.
So that is a memory. Wow. That's, I can't remember too much about that day.
Sure.
But I certainly remember that.
Wow. That's a story I've never heard. I thought I'd read everything. Talk to us a little bit about the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, its mission, and that team has tried cases around immigration, detention, mass incarceration, racial discrimination, and law enforcement. Which of these do you think has the greatest potential to shape the direction of civil and human rights in our country?
Well, it was organized in 1968 to carry forward Robert Kennedy's unfinished work on social justice. And when he was Attorney General, he learned about the federal bail system, and he wanted to change it, and he did. So federal bail still has some problems, but state bail is horrendous. It really targets people of color. And so that's one of the issues that we work on at RFK Human Rights. We did the largest mass bailout in the history of Texas, and then we did the largest mass bailout in the history of the United States in New York, just to prove that people were being held in jail pre-trial, not because of their proclivity to commit crime, but only because they are too poor to pay bail. So Harvey Weinstein, for instance, was accused by 93 women of rape and sexual assault. He paid $1 million and he got out of jail. You have all these high school kids in New York, hundreds of them, who can't make the bail, and so they're sitting in jail for months up to a year. Okay, so we do that. We work on sorry.
It's okay.
We work on immigration reform that is really targeted at people of color and specifically Black people. So we've done a lot of work getting Haitians, immigrants to have status so that they can stay in this country and not return to Haiti. Last year we won similar status for about 40,000 people from Africa. And other issues, we're working hard right now on closing down ICE detention centers in Louisiana. And we also just won a case in Minnesota which stops the use of solitary confinement in youth prisons. So that's the type of work we do. 100% of it is with local partners who have been working on these issues sometimes for months, sometimes for years. So we couldn't do it without the people working with us.
What would you advise to give to the next generation of civil and human rights activists that may be in their youth?
Get involved. First of all, learn your rights. Learn about community organizing, because you can't do it alone, you have to do it with a group. Work on social emotional learning, because you need to be strategic about when to get in someone's face and be angry, and when to hold back your outrage at injustice because you're not going to be effective. And then find groups. It might be in your church. It might be Amnesty International, which has a great youth program. It might become a John Lewis Young Leader at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Find where Stacey Abrams is making a difference and join her. But just get involved. Exercise your ability to create change. Can I say something else?
Absolutely.
One thing that middle school students can do is exercise moral courage. So moral courage is not standing up to the common oppressor. It's standing up to your friends. It's standing up to your colleagues. It's standing up to your family and saying what we're doing is wrong. And you need to exercise that moral courage. So when you hear a racist joke or somebody says something online that's cruel, or you're just here seeing somebody being a bully, don't walk away. Say, I don't want to hear that joke. you can still be friends and laugh, and you can diverge the conversation to saying, I don't want to hear that joke, but where'd you get that pretty tie? You know, you can change the conversation. But it's like you're exercising a muscle, and you'll either exercise the muscle that says, do nothing or walk away or don't cause that kind of trouble, or you exercise the muscle that says stand up. And the more you exercise that, the more it's going to become muscle memory. And then when you become a high school student or college student, or you enter the workplace, you're going to be among those who say, I'm going to create change.
Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy, for joining us today, and congratulations on your honor.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
We have our distinguished honoree, Freedom Award recipient, none other than Mrs. Stacey Abrams. And it's such an honor to have you here this afternoon. We just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you have been working on in the past several decades and concerns with voting rights. You know, at the National Civil Rights Museum, we tell the story of our civic duty as citizens, of American internal demand, the right to suffrage, the passages of the 15th and 19th Amendment. Today, talk a little bit about some of the core strategies for suppressing voting rights, and is there a fear in the shift of power if all voters participate?
The United States has long engaged in voter suppression. It began with the Constitution's exclusion of people of color, of women, of communities writ large. And every decade has been about how do we not only increase access to the right to vote, but how do we diminish the tendency of our government to try to stop us from participating. Voter suppression has three pieces. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and does that ballot get counted? And so almost every strategy that we have seen to silence the voices of those who should be able to participate in democracy has been undergirded by one of those three strategies. Denying access to registration, that whether we're talking about literacy tests or poll taxes. Denying the ability to stay on the rolls. The fact that in the United States, failure to vote can be a predicate for taking your name off of the rolls, even though you are not required to cast a ballot. Second, can you cast your ballot? When they move polling places, when they close polling places, when they deny access to absentee ballots, that's an attempt to stop you from casting your vote. And then lastly, it is having your vote actually thrown out. It's having provisional ballots discounted. It's being told that because you are an ex-offender, because you're a returning citizen, that you do not have the right to participate. Across the board, we have seen multiple strategies, but the important piece is that we have also seen people rise up and meet those challenges by coming up with ways to either directly confront or to amplify the challenges they face in order to create more space for voting.
Wow. And so is increased voter turnout the best plan for overcoming this type of suppression? And what other major factors that contribute to the success of the grassroots efforts to increase voter turnout?
Our first responsibility is registration. The more of us who are on the rolls, the harder it is to stop us from participating. The second strategy, though, is that we have to actually show up. We have to show up not only in federal elections, but in state and local elections, because under the Constitution, most of the laws governing how we access the ballot, those laws aren't created at the federal level. Those are state and local laws. And so we have to participate at the state and local level. Current day voter suppression is almost entirely the product of state legislation. And so know who your state legislators are. Know who your city council and county commission members are, because they are the ones who determine your access to the polls. And then third, we have to remember that the largest ability to have our voices heard is to show up after an election. Mm-hmm. It is one thing to put someone in office, but it's like giving someone the keys to your store and leaving for 4 years hoping that they don't rob you blind while you're gone. And so we have to understand that our responsibility is not simply to exercise the right to vote, but to use the power of the vote by removing or putting people in place and holding them accountable in between each election.
And let's expand upon that. What would you say to those that feel that when the time comes to register to vote or to vote for any election, whether it's president or midterms, and you hear the notion that, well, my one vote won't count? What would you say to that person as to why their vote does count?
In 2018, I lost the election to be the first black woman governor in American history by 54,317 votes. There were more than 1 million people who didn't cast a ballot.
Wow.
And that many of them were denied access, but several of them had the opportunity and simply chose not to use it. And I do not begrudge them their dismay, their cynicism. I reject the idea of apathy, though, because it's often not that we don't care, it's that we don't believe. And so my approach is this. Voting is not magic. Your ballot is not going to change the world. But voting is medicine. It is how we treat the ills of society. It's how we tackle the diseases that have assailed our communities. It's how we address injustice, but it's also how we create opportunity. For so many years, we have seen voting as an antidote to evil, but it's also an access to good. The things we want come about when we have our voices heard, when we can shape what happens. And if it didn't work, there would not have been a 240-year effort to silence us. And so we have to believe in not only the power that we see, but the power that is hidden from us, because it's hidden underneath a ballot.
What would you tell yourself on the campus of Spelman University, who's just coming into your own and as a voting rights advocate? Looking back now, what would you say to yourself then?
When I was a college freshman, I was 17 at Spelman, registering to vote, or trying to register others. I wasn't old enough to vote yet myself. And the issue I faced was convincing young people that it was worth engaging. As a 49-year-old, I am now facing a different challenge, which is trying to preserve access to the right to vote. I enjoyed the protection of the Voting Rights Act. That is no longer in place. And for my niece and nephew who turn 18 this year and next year, they don't have the same protections that I had. And so I would tell my younger self that what I am doing is not only necessary, it is inevitable that someone is going to try to undo this work. And so I would be proud of the work I'm doing, but I would warn myself that the work will not be done until everyone has the right to vote.
Wow, absolutely. The current situation politically in the country, are you optimism and hopeful, or do you feel that the United States in that spectrum and arena is recycling back into old ways?
Democracy is a construct. We like to pretend that it's this real thing, but it's the collective imagination of community. We say to one another, I'm going to loan you my power and borrow yours to make decisions. That's what democracy is. And sometimes your power is going to be stronger than my own, but we're going to have this common cause. We owe each other something, and so we're going to work together. We have always had a tension in this nation about whose power was real and who had access to that power. And so I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I'm determined, because the validity and quality of our democracy depends on the people and our willingness to believe that we have the right to more. And so my work is always grounded in how do I help people see and believe that they're entitled to more. I grew up with working class people in southern Mississippi. My parents, my mom used to call us the genteel poor. Like, that's how little we had. But they always believed we were entitled to more. And that's where democracy has its strength. When we believe that we are entitled to more and therefore can work for more because we believe that we can actually get more. Democracy survives and thrives not by forgetting the past, but by understanding the past is always right behind us and ready to come back.
Wow. And to conclude, how has your appointment at a leading historically black college and university shaped your plans to engage a new generation around critical public policy decisions?
So I've been honored to hold the inaugural chair, the Ronald Walters Chair for Race and Black Politics. And to me, that is a call to action. Race matters in our country. Diversity is one of our strengths, but it is also a tool that's been weaponized against our people for so many years, from this nation's beginning. But it's how we grow, it's how we build, it's what is inevitable. Equity is about not getting exactly the same thing, but having the right to participate. And inclusion means that when our voices are lifted up, we may not be the loudest, but we will be in the chorus. The work that I can do at Howard, the work I can do is not just about what happens at Howard, but how Howard as an HBCU connects to HBCUs across the country, and how communities of color beginning with Black people, but including an entire diaspora, that we have the ability to imagine more, to demand more, and to create more. And that, to me, is the extraordinary power of not only Ron Walter's legacy, but the legacy of the National Civil Rights Museum, of my parents, and of everyone who's ever worked for more.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Stacey Abrams, 2023 Freedom Award honoree from the National Civil Rights Museum. Thank you for all that you've done, and congratulations on your award.
Thank you.
All right.
Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.